The storm had not yet reached the castle, but thunder already shook the glass. "You killed them. You made me an orphan." Her voice trembled, a mixture of fury and heartbreak. "My family, my blood, you." Jackson didn't deny it. He just stood there, rain dripping from his shoulders, eyes hollow as the truth burned between them. "I carried out a royal order," he said, voice rough with something deeper than guilt. Janice took a step back, clutching the letter in her fist, the royal seal glinting through her tears. "You signed their death warrant." "I signed my own damnation," he answered quietly, "and I'd do anything to undo it." Lightning slashed the sky behind them, throwing their faces into stark relief, a woman broken by truth, a man crushed by his past. But before the silence could swallow them both, she whispered, "I was 9, when you burned my home." He flinched as if struck. Before he called her his equal, he destroyed everything she loved.
The rain had not stopped for hours. It came down in furious sheets, hammering the carriage roof until the sound swallowed every word Janice's adoptive father said. Outside, the cobbled streets of Westmere gleamed with the reflection of carriage lamps, golden streaks trembling over puddles as if the earth itself wept. Inside, the air was thick with ink, damp wool, and the faint metallic scent of coin. Her father's quill scratched across parchment. Every stroke cut another thread of her freedom. He didn't look at her, not once. He sat beside the Duke's solicitor, hands shaking slightly as he signed his name beneath the royal seal, his lips pressing together in grim determination. The man she had called father for 19 years had the look of someone convincing himself that cruelty was duty, that betrayal could be justified. "You understand," he said at last, his voice low and businesslike. "This is what's best for everyone." Janice's fingers curled tightly around the hem of her worn gown. "For everyone," she repeated, tasting the lie. Her voice was small, but it carried. He did not answer. On the table before them sat a chest of gold sovereigns, the Duke's price. The gleam of the coins reflected in her father's eyes, dull and desperate. Her mother, pale and silent at his side, stared down at her lap as though she could not bear to meet her gaze. The solicitor closed the documents, sealing them with wax. "By His Majesty's decree," he announced, "the marriage contract is binding. The Duke of Westmere has fulfilled all conditions." The carriage door opened. A gust of rain-scented wind rushed in, scattering a few loose pages across the floor. Janice stood there motionless, her heart hammering in her throat. Beyond the doorway, a figure waited beneath a black umbrella, tall, still, utterly unmoved by the storm. Jackson, Duke of Westmere. He was younger than the rumours suggested, but colder too. Eyes like winter glass, posture as rigid as the marble statues she'd once dusted in their merchant's home. The rain did not dare touch him. It seemed to slide away as if repelled by his will alone. "Bring her," he said simply. Her father hesitated, then took her arm. His grip was firm but trembling. "Do not shame us, Janice. You'll live better than you ever have." She wanted to ask, better for whom? But the words tangled behind her teeth. Outside, thunder cracked, echoing through the narrow street. She lifted her chin, refusing to cry. If she had learned anything in that house, it was that tears changed nothing. The Duke offered no hand to help her into the carriage that would take her to Westmere Hall. He merely stepped aside, his gloved fingers tightening briefly on the umbrella handle as his gaze swept over her, a merchant's daughter in a threadbare gown, trembling but unbowed. He noticed that, the faint defiance in her jaw. "Get in," he said, voice low, even. She did. As the wheels began to turn, she looked back through the rain-blurred window. Her father stood in the doorway of the inn, clutching the gold as if afraid it might vanish. Her mother's shawl fluttered in the wind. Neither waved. The road stretched ahead, slick and black, lined with shadowed trees. Inside the carriage, silence ruled. Only the rhythmic clatter of wheels against stone and the occasional hiss of thunder filled the air. Janice sat opposite the Duke. He watched the storm outside, not her. The faint lamplight flickered over his face, sharpening the edges of his cheekbones, catching on the scar that traced a thin line from temple to jaw, a pale reminder of battles fought long before this night. Finally, he spoke. "I do not require affection," he said without turning, "nor conversation. This arrangement fulfills a royal command, nothing more." Janice's pulse thudded in her ears. "And what do you require, Your Grace?" He looked at her then, slow, assessing. "Obedience." The word hung between them, heavy as the rain. She drew in a shaky breath. "I see. Do you?" His gaze lingered, piercing. "I doubt it." Her hands tightened in her lap. "I see that you bought me in the name of marriage, my lord, and I see that you think that makes you powerful." The flicker of surprise in his eyes was brief, but unmistakable. For a moment his composure cracked, just enough to reveal curiosity. "Careful," he said softly. "The walls of Westmere have no patience for rebellion." "Then it seems they'll have to learn," she replied before she could stop herself. The Duke's lips curved, not into a smile but into something sharper. "You have a spine, I'll grant you that." Outside, lightning split the sky, painting the world in silver. For an instant, his reflection glimmered in the carriage window beside hers. Two strangers bound by ink, gold, and a king's decree. The rain grew harsher, each drop a drumbeat against fate. Hours later, the carriage rolled through iron gates flanked by gargoyles and towering hedges. Westmere Hall loomed ahead, vast, unlit, ancient. Its windows glowed faintly like the eyes of some sleeping beast. The moment she stepped out, mud splashed her hem. The air was colder here, touched with sea salt from the cliffs beyond. She could hear waves crashing somewhere far off, unseen but relentless. Servants appeared, silent as ghosts. They bowed to the Duke, not to her. "Prepare her rooms," he ordered. The butler nodded. "Yes, Your Grace. Shall we announce the marriage in the morning?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "There will be no announcement. Not yet." Janice turned toward him. "You're ashamed," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "I am cautious. Caution feels a lot like shame, Your Grace." For a heartbeat, the courtyard seemed to still. The rain slowed. Even the servants froze. Then he stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Do not mistake this house for your home, not yet. You were not brought to rule it." "Then why?" He studied her face, the anger she tried to hide, the trembling she refused to show. "Because the king demanded it," he said finally, "and I obeyed." He turned, leaving her standing in the rain. She watched him disappear into the grand doors, her gown heavy with water, her hair plastered to her neck. The servants led her up the stone steps, their torches flickering against the wind. Every corner of the hall whispered of history. Portraits of stern ancestors, tapestries depicting battles, corridors that smelled faintly of smoke and candle wax. Somewhere deep inside, a clock chimed midnight. When they left her alone, she stood before the tall window of her new chamber, looking out at the storm that had carried her here. The sea was visible now, churning under a bruised sky. Her reflection looked ghostly in the glass, pale skin, wide eyes, the faintest tremor at the corner of her mouth. In that moment, something inside her settled, not peace, but resolve. She whispered it softly to herself, to the storm, to the darkness beyond the window. "If I must be caged," she said, "I will not break." The wind howled in answer, rattling the panes like applause. Down below, the Duke paused at his study door, hearing her words carried faintly through the corridor. For the first time in years, a ghost of something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Not pity, not anger. Something that felt dangerously like respect. He poured himself a glass of wine, eyes fixed on the storm. She will, he murmured to no one, find that the cage has teeth. But even as he said it, the words rang hollow. Because somewhere deep within the heart of Westmere Hall he already knew, this girl he had bought would one day own far more than his name. Would you forgive the ones who sold you? The next morning came quietly, as if the storm had spent itself. Pale light spilled through tall windows, sliding across the carved ceiling of Janice's new chamber. The air was damp and cold, the kind of chill that crept into the bones and refused to leave. She rose before the servants arrived, wrapped herself in the wool shawl left on the chair, and wandered to the window. The grounds of Westmere stretched endlessly, gardens arranged with military precision, fountains still under the weight of rain, and beyond them the cliff edge where sea met sky. Even from this height, the crash of waves reached her faintly, steady and mournful. By the time the maid entered, carrying a tray of tea and a folded gown, Janice had already begun to understand that this house breathed differently. Every sound was cautious, every movement measured. Even laughter, she suspected, was rationed here. "His Grace dines in the West Hall this evening," the maid said softly, not meeting her eyes. "You are to attend." Janice nodded, her throat dry. "And until then?" "You may walk the gardens, if you wish, but do not stray toward the stables. His Grace dislikes intrusions." The maid hesitated as if to say more, then curtsied and left. By dusk, Westmere Hall glowed with firelight. Shadows bent and straightened as she descended the staircase, her steps echoing faintly off marble. Her gown was simple, grey silk with no jewels, but it suited her. She had always preferred things that did not draw attention, though here she suspected invisibility was impossible. The dining hall stretched long and severe, its walls lined with portraits that watched from gilt frames. At the far end sat the Duke of Westmere. He didn't rise when she entered. His posture was perfect, his expression unreadable. The only sound came from the tick of the clock and the whisper of the servant setting silver. "Sit," he said. She obeyed, her pulse loud in her ears. Dinner passed first in silence. The servants moved like shadows, pouring, clearing, vanishing. When the last dish was set before them, Jackson lifted his glass. "I trust your rooms are satisfactory." "Yes, my lord." "Not my lord," he corrected, eyes still on his wine. "My title is your grace. You will use it." Her fingers tightened on the stem of her glass. "As you wish, your grace." "Good." He paused, as though listening for rebellion in her tone. Finding none, he continued, "You are free to walk the gardens or the library. You are not free to leave the estate without permission." "I see," she said. "I doubt you do." His gaze met hers then, cold, steady. "Freedom is a fragile thing here. Best not test it." She should have bowed her head, should have stayed silent. But something in her, the part that had endured years of polite cruelty, refused to yield. "You sound like a man who's tested it himself, your grace." A flicker, just a heartbeat of surprise in those grey eyes before the mask slid back into place. "You are observant." "I had to be," she said. The faintest curve touched his mouth, half amusement, half warning. "Careful. Wit is welcome in Westmere only when it knows its place." Jackson still studied her across the table, the silence between them brittle as glass. "You never speak of where you came from," he said finally. "Your adoptive father mentioned nothing beyond a merchant's charity." Janice hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "There isn't much to tell. I remember little before them," she replied, trying to conceal her pains. He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "And your true name?" "My adoptive parents kept it," she said, almost absently. "Janice Harland." The name hung in the air. For a heartbeat, his hand stilled on the armrest, a subtle flinch she might not have noticed if she'd been looking. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "Harland," he repeated softly, as if testing the taste of the word. So I'm told, she murmured. He inclined his head and reached for his wine again, though his mind had already gone elsewhere. He didn't know why that name unsettled him, only that it did. He resumed his meal, and for several minutes the only sound was the steady scrape of silver against porcelain. Yet beneath his composure, she sensed something strained, an invisible rope drawn tight between control and exhaustion. When the meal ended, he rose first. Elias will show you the library. And just like that, she was dismissed. Elias found her waiting near the great staircase, her hands clasped behind her back as she studied the portraits. You've survived your first dinner, he said with a gentle smile. That's more than most manage. I wasn't aware survival was a requirement, she replied. He chuckled softly. In this house, it's a quiet kind of art. The steward led her through a long corridor lined with tall windows. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames bending with every passing draught. You'll find His Grace a difficult man, Elias said finally, but not an unfair one. I'm not sure I see the difference. He glanced at her. Perhaps not yet. The library doors stood open. Inside, the room was vast, rows of books climbing 2 stories high, ladders of polished oak leaning against the shelves. The air smelled of paper and cedar. For the first time since arriving, she felt something ease in her chest. Do you read, my lady? Elias asked. I do, often. Then this may be the only part of Westmere that will feel like mercy. She smiled faintly. Was that meant to comfort me? Not quite. His voice softened, meant only as truth. He turned to leave but hesitated at the doorway. If you'll allow an old man's advice, watch the Duke's eyes, not his words. They betray him more than he knows. When he was gone, Janice traced her fingers along the spines of the books. Many bore the family crest, generations of dukes who'd recorded their wars, alliances, triumphs. Each volume felt heavy with expectation. She chose one at random and sank into the window seat. The candlelight trembled with the wind, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Her thoughts wandered backward again, unwanted but familiar. Her father's study, filled with ledgers and the smell of ink. You'll understand when you're older, he'd said the night he sold her, his tone full of tired certainty. The world has no place for sentiment. But it wasn't age she needed to understand him. It was greed. She remembered her mother's delicate hands adjusting her collar before every dinner, whispering, "Smile, Janice. They're watching." As though affection was something to be performed, not felt. Even when she tried her hardest, cooked, mended, obeyed, there had always been that distance, that invisible wall reminding her she was only borrowed. It had been Brandon, her adoptive brother, who taught her cruelty young. He'd taken her childhood toys and told her she was lucky he didn't take the roof over her head. "We don't owe you love," he once said. "Only shelter." And now she owed them a dowry. The fire crackled, snapping her back to the present. A faint sound made her lift her head, the scrape of boots against stone. Jackson stood at the threshold, his coat undone, the same distant expression carved onto his face. "I didn't give permission to roam," he said. "I was shown the way," she replied. "By Elias, no doubt." His tone was flat. "He's too fond of kindness." "Is that a fault?" "It's a weakness." Janice closed her book. "Strange. You speak as if kindness were more dangerous than cruelty." His eyes met hers. "It is." He stepped into the light then, and for the first time she saw it clearly. The exhaustion beneath the composure, the faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the weight of solitude pressed into his stance. He looked not like a monster, but like a man who had forgotten how to stop defending himself. "You dislike me already," he said quietly. "I don't know you well enough to dislike you." "Then you will," he said, almost to himself. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, she said, "You seem lonely, Your Grace." He froze. The silence stretched until she thought he wouldn't answer. Then very softly, "Lonely men don't notice they're alone." He walked out before she could reply, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Later that night, Elias returned with a tray of tea. "He spoke to you, didn't he?" Janice looked up from the fire. "If you can call it that." The steward smiled faintly. "He doesn't speak to many. You must have startled him." "I doubt the Duke of Westmere startles easily." Elias poured the tea with practiced care. "He does, though he hides it well. The man you met tonight is not the one I knew years ago. Once he laughed. Once he played the piano after supper. His mother used to tease that his laughter shook the dust from these old halls." "What changed him?" she asked. Elias's eyes glistened in the firelight. "Loss," he said simply, "of a kind that never heals cleanly." He left her with that. Janice sat long after the fire had burned low. Somewhere in the distance a door slammed. The house sighed. She thought of the Duke's voice, low and tired, saying, "Lonely men don't notice they're alone." And for the first time, she wondered not what he could do to her, but what the world had already done to him. Outside, the fog thickened again, wrapping Westmere in grey silence. Somewhere beyond it, the sea beat against the cliffs like a steady, mournful heart. A question lingered as she drifted toward sleep, fragile as candlelight. What could break a man enough to make him fear kindness? The morning after her uneasy dinner with the Duke, Westmere Hall began to hum with rare activity. Carriages arrived one after another, wheels crunching the gravel drive, voices and laughter spilling into the air like perfume and smoke. Servants moved briskly, lighting more lamps, polishing silver until it gleamed like mirrors. A formal gathering, the first since her arrival, had been announced without warning. From her window, Janice watched as nobles stepped down from their coaches, their cloaks snapping in the wind. She recognised their manner even from a distance, confidence laced with condescension. These were the people who ruled through rumour, the kind who could ruin a woman with a single whispered sentence. Her maid fussed nervously as she helped her dress. "His Grace hosts few events, my lady. The court will take this as a sign." "A sign of what?" "That he's changed," the maid murmured. "Or that he's been forced to." Janice said nothing. Her gown tonight was pale ivory, chosen by someone else. It fit too well, the kind of perfection that made her feel like a statue carved to please. When the bells chimed 7, she followed the line of servants down the staircase, her pulse quickening with each step. The grand hall shimmered under chandeliers. Every inch of marble reflected candlelight, every corner watched by curious eyes. Nobles in silks and velvets gathered in small circles, whispering behind their fans. At the head of the room, Jackson stood with the ease of a man bred for command. He wore black trimmed in silver, his signet ring glinting as he lifted a glass in greeting. When his gaze found her across the crowd, something unreadable flickered in his eyes, approval, perhaps, or warning. She crossed the hall, bowing slightly when she reached him. "Your Grace," she said softly. He inclined his head. "You're late." "I thought you invited me, not summoned me." A faint smirk touched his mouth, gone before it could be real. At Westmere, those are the same thing. They stood together under the scrutiny of dozens. The air seemed to tighten around them, weighted with curiosity. It did not take long for the whispers to begin. "Is that her?" someone murmured. "The merchant's daughter?" "No, the adopted one." "Imagine selling your charity child to a cruel duke." "Some families have no shame." Janice felt their stares like nettles against her skin. The conversations fluttered louder, polite laughter slicing the air. Through it all, Jackson said nothing. He watched the crowd as if measuring them, calculating which insult would draw first blood. Lady Melina, tall, beautiful and cruelly amused, drifted forward. She'd once been rumoured to seek the Duke's favour herself. Now she curtsied with feigned sweetness. "Your Grace, how noble of you to extend your generosity to those of lesser birth. Tell me, does your new Duchess dine with the servants or with you?" A ripple of laughter followed her words. Janice's hands went cold. She held her breath, waiting for him to speak, for anything. But Jackson only lifted his glass, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps both," Melina continued, her smile sharpening. "Old habits are hard to break after all. Or perhaps the poor girl doesn't know which fork to use." The laughter swelled. Janice's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand taller. If this was what they wanted, humiliation, she would give them dignity instead. She reached for her glass of water, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Forgive me, my lady," she said, her voice calm and clear. "But I imagine forks are easier to master than manners." The laughter died abruptly. Melina's eyes widened, and for the first time that evening Jackson's head turned sharply toward Janice. The silence stretched, a fragile moment suspended on the edge of disaster. Then Melina recovered, smiling coldly. "How charming. The stray has teeth. Tell me, does she bite too?" A few men chuckled nervously, glancing toward the Duke. He still hadn't spoken. Janice's heart pounded. "Say something. End this." But he remained silent, his gaze locked on Melina with the precision of a blade before the strike. It was Melina's next words that shattered the restraint in the room. "Pity," she said sweetly. "That coin can buy a wedding, but not a pedigree." The word coin landed like a slap. The laughter that followed was cruel and easy. Then came the sound that silenced it all. The scrape of the Duke's chair against marble. Jackson rose. The air changed with him. Every whisper, every smirk, every breath seemed to vanish as he straightened to his full height. Candlelight struck the hard planes of his face, the controlled fury in his eyes. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "You mock my wife," he said, each word crisp as glass, "because she reminds you of something you will never admit, that worth is not born of blood." The room froze. Melina's painted smile faltered. Jackson's gaze swept over the assembly, cold and merciless. "If lineage is all that gives you value, then I pity your ancestors. They built empires only for you to inherit their arrogance." No one dared breathe. He looked to Janice, his expression softening just enough to be dangerous. "My wife," he said, the words heavy with meaning, "needs no defense, but my house will not host those who mistake cruelty for wit." The silence that followed was absolute. Melina curtsied stiffly, her face burning. "Forgive me, Your Grace. My jest was ill-made." "Indeed," he replied. "See that it never happens again." He turned away before she could answer, offering his arm to Janice. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. His touch was firm, grounding. Together, they left the hall beneath the gaze of the entire court, whispers blooming in their wake like wildfire. Later, in the solitude of the West Corridor, Janice stopped. Her breath still trembled. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "They'll turn on you for it." "They already have," he said simply. She looked up at him. The mask he wore before others was gone now, replaced by something rawer, a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Why did you defend me?" she asked. "You let them mock me until—" "Until they mocked me," he finished. His tone was sharp but not cruel. "Do not mistake my restraint for indifference. I defended my name, not you." Her chest ached at his words, though she told herself she shouldn't care. "Then your name is safe, Your Grace. Congratulations." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Janice." It was the first time he'd said her name without coldness. When she faced him again, he was closer than she expected. The candlelight caught the edges of his profile, the faint shadow along his jaw. His eyes, pale grey, flecked with silver, were no longer distant. His gloved hand brushed hers as if by accident, but the contact jolted through her like lightning. His composure cracked just slightly. The hand that rested at his side trembled before he clenched it into a fist. "I meant what I said," he murmured, his voice lower now, almost reluctant. "They fear what they cannot own." "And what do you fear?" she asked before she could stop herself. His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. "That I might start to care." For a long moment neither spoke. The air between them was too heavy for words. Then he stepped back, reclaiming the mask that kept the world at a safe distance. "Go to your rooms. Tomorrow the scandal will spread. You'll need your strength to endure it." She should have felt only anger, but beneath it, something else stirred. Something she couldn't name. As she turned down the corridor, the sound of his footsteps faded behind her. Yet she could still feel the tremor of his hand against hers, faint and unintentional, echoing like a secret she wasn't supposed to know. In her chamber, she stood before the window, watching the sea churn under the moonlight. He had defended her not as a husband, but as a man protecting his pride. And yet, for one impossible heartbeat, she'd felt something different, something dangerously close to longing. Outside, thunder rolled again, not from the sky, but from the court that would awaken tomorrow hungry for scandal. And somewhere in the dark halls below, the Duke of Westmere poured himself another glass of wine, his hand still unsteady. He told himself it was rage. He knew it wasn't. The scandal from the dinner spread through the court like wildfire. By morning, gossip had already reached every estate in the region, twisted, exaggerated, alive. Servants whispered in corridors, letters arrived sealed in crimson wax, and noblewomen clutched their pearls as they told the tale. The merchant's adopted daughter had humiliated Lady Melina, and the Duke of Westmere had defended her with fury in his eyes. Janice could feel the shift in the air, as though the walls themselves had begun to listen. Wherever she went, footsteps followed, whispers trailed. Yet the Duke moved as though nothing had changed. He breakfasted in silence, studied in solitude, and vanished to the stables each afternoon. The gossips didn't stop Jackson. He made Janice the Duchess of Westmere before she even understood what it meant to be a wife. It took her days to learn the rhythm of the house, not from instruction but from observation. Every morning before dawn he rode along the cliffs, returning just as the servants began to stir. He ate sparingly, read excessively, and rarely spoke more than was required. He demanded perfection, but rewarded loyalty in quiet ways. A stable boy's sick mother received medicine from his private physician. A maid dismissed unjustly by the steward was quietly reinstated. None of these acts were ever mentioned aloud. The Duke pretended indifference to them, and yet Janice noticed the small hesitations in his expression each time gratitude brushed too close. He was a man who hid his kindness as carefully as his pain, and that fascinated her. She tried not to admit it, even to herself. But the curiosity grew with every passing day. His contradictions gnawed at her, the cruelty in his tone when he gave orders, the gentleness in his hands when he poured his tea. Their paths crossed more often now, though never by design. Once in the library, when she found him standing by the window, reading with one gloved hand pressed to the glass. Another time in the stables, where he spoke to a mare so softly she almost didn't recognize his voice. She didn't speak then, only watched, unseen. But the sight of him there, gentling a frightened animal, unsettled her more than his coldness ever had. It was a week later, in the rose garden, that the tension between them finally broke. The day was grey, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Janice had taken to walking the garden in the afternoons. It was the only place in the estate that didn't feel like a cage. She was kneeling by the hedges, pruning away dead stems, when she heard footsteps behind her. "You've made the gardener nervous," came the Duke's voice. She rose, brushing soil from her skirt. "He doesn't like me touching his roses." "Few do," he said, hands clasped behind his back. Roses are delicate. They don't respond well to inexperienced hands. Then they're lucky, she replied evenly. I'm used to being unwanted in delicate places. A muscle in his jaw twitched. You enjoy testing me. I only speak when spoken to. He took a slow step closer. You speak to provoke. Her pulse fluttered, but she refused to look away. And you listen to control. For a heartbeat, silence fell between them, taut and electric. Then she said quietly, You rule this house as though it were an army. Every man, every woman, even the flowers bend to your command. He arched a brow. And that offends you? It saddens me, she said, stepping closer, because they obey from fear, not respect. You treat them as tools, not people. His eyes hardened. People have only ever used me. I learned to use them first. The words struck like a blade, not because of their cruelty, but because of the ache buried beneath. She stared at him. Is that what you think I'll do? Use you? He hesitated. Everyone does. Not everyone. He laughed, a low, hollow sound. You'd be surprised how quickly conviction turns to convenience. Then perhaps you've never given anyone reason to stay, she said softly. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then away. Careful, Janice. You play a dangerous game. Do I? She whispered. Or is it only dangerous because you've forgotten how to trust? Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, longing, something too human to name. He turned away, his voice rough. This conversation is over. She didn't follow. Instead, she watched him go, the black of his coat dissolving into the grey mist. When he was gone, she pressed her hands against her chest and exhaled a trembling breath she hadn't realised she'd been holding. That night, she couldn't sleep. His words echoed through her mind. People have only ever used me. She wondered what had happened to make him believe that. What had broken him so deeply that compassion now felt like a threat. By morning, the gossip had reached the countryside beyond Westmere. Letters from distant relatives arrived, some laced with curiosity, others with venom. The servants whispered louder now. The adopted girl tamed the devil duke. The phrase haunted her. Tamed, as if he were some wild thing she'd leashed. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity, and yet, when she caught him watching her from across the hall, his expression unreadable, her stomach twisted with something she couldn't name. He said nothing of the rumours, but she noticed changes. Small ones. He began taking his meals in the same room again, though they ate mostly in silence. He started asking questions that had nothing to do with obedience. Do you read before bed? What did you think of the roses? Why do you never smile when you're alone? She didn't know how to answer any of them. One evening, while the rain battered the windows, she found herself outside his study door, holding a letter addressed to him. The seal bore the royal crest. She hesitated, then knocked. Enter. He looked up from his desk, eyes tired but alert. Another letter from London? Yes, she said, placing it down. The handwriting looks urgent. He slit it open without ceremony, scanned the page, then set it aside. His expression didn't change, but the knuckles of his hand had gone white. Bad news? She asked. Expected news, he said shortly. She tilted her head. You won't tell me. It isn't your concern. You bound my life to yours by law and decree. That makes everything about you my concern, whether I wish it or not. The words cut through the room. His gaze snapped up, cold again, the mask reassembled. Careful, he murmured. I don't recall giving you permission to forget your place. Her throat burned. And what place is that? The one you paid for? Silence. Then, to her astonishment, he stood. You think I enjoy this? His voice was low, strained. That I wanted any of this farce. Then why agree to it? He turned sharply, the edge in his tone cracking. Because the king commanded it. Because duty is all I have left. Because disobedience cost me everything once, and I will not lose again. The confession hung in the air, raw and unguarded. For the first time she saw not the Duke, but the man, cornered, furious, afraid. He sank back into his chair, breathing hard. "Go," he said quietly. "Before I forget, I owe you restraint." She didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer, voice trembling but steady. "You haven't lost everything, Jackson." The sound of his name on her lips made him flinch. "I've seen the way you look at this place," she said. "You still care. You care so much it terrifies you." He closed his eyes. "You mistake pity for insight." "No," she whispered. "I mistake walls for wounds." When she finally left the study, his glass of wine sat untouched, his head bowed into his hands. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, brittle peace strung between them like wire. Sometimes they passed each other in silence, sometimes their words sparked like flint. Yet beneath it all ran a quiet current, dangerous, magnetic, alive. Every glance lasted a second too long. Every silence felt heavier than words. Janice caught herself listening for his footsteps in the corridor at night. Jackson, though he would never admit it, found himself walking the long way to his chamber, a path that passed her door. The world beyond Westmere was whispering about their scandal. But inside those walls, something else was happening, something that neither dared name. And as the spring rain began to fall again, the Duke of Westmere found himself standing by the garden window, watching the woman who was supposed to be his obligation. She moved through the roses with her head held high, sunlight threading through her hair. For the first time in years, he let the thought come, unbidden and dangerous. What if the cage had been waiting not to hold me, but to free me? The storm that had rolled in over the coast was unlike the gentle rains Janice had come to love. This one screamed through the trees and clawed at the windows, bending the garden roses until petals tore loose like red snow. Inside Westmere Hall, candles guttered against the wind, and the house seemed to hold its breath. She sat in the library, surrounded by stacks of letters, documents she had found that morning while searching for a book to quiet her thoughts. They were old, sealed with the crest of the crown, and tucked away behind a false panel in the Duke's desk. She hadn't meant to pry, but the seal was cracked, as if once torn open in haste, and the name scrawled at the bottom had frozen her blood. Her father's name, Lord Alaric Harland. The ink was faded, but the words remained legible. The accusation had been simple: treason against the crown, conspiracy with northern rebels. The order beneath it, signed in the king's own hand, had condemned the Harland family to death and confiscated their lands for reallocation. Her hands began to tremble. The sound of the rain against the glass grew distant, almost hollow. Then her eyes caught a smaller signature, written beneath the royal decree, a signature she knew better than her own. Jackson, strategist of the crown. The world tilted. The papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the carpet like fallen snow. The Duke had killed her family. She stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the evidence lay before her in neat, merciless handwriting. Every kindness, every flicker of warmth she had dared to believe in, all of it shattered. She didn't hear him at first when the door opened. Janice. His voice was quiet, almost tentative. But when he stepped into the light, his gaze fell upon the scattered letters, and something in his face changed. He froze. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw fear in his eyes. "Where did you find those?" She lifted her chin. "Behind your desk." Her voice trembled, but her stare didn't. "You kept them." He didn't answer at once. His breath faltered, his eyes darting from the papers to her face. And then she saw it, the flicker of recognition, the way his entire body seemed to go still. It wasn't the letters that frightened him. It was her, Janice, he whispered, barely audible. What? What did you say your name was? Her brows knit. It's on the papers. Janice Harland. I told you that after we wed. His expression hollowed, colour draining from his face. Harland, he repeated as though the name itself were a ghost. He reached for the desk to steady himself, but his hand shook. By God. It can't be. What can't? She demanded. He met her gaze, and for once the iron mask cracked. Pain, sharp, undeniable, flashed through his eyes. Your family, the estate on the northern border, the Harlands were... Her heart stuttered. Were what? I was there, he said hoarsely. I was 19. The king sent me to execute his order against them. I believed... He stopped himself, the rest of the words choking in his throat. Her body went cold. You were there? The truth unfurled in the silence like poison. You burned their home, she whispered. You killed them. His breath hitched. I didn't know a child survived. Her voice rose, ragged. A child you drove from her home, who hid in the woods while soldiers slaughtered her family. She backed away from him, her face pale as ash. I was 9. I remember the fire, the shouting. Someone dragged me into the trees, told me not to scream. Her voice broke. It was a servant. She carried me until the dawn, then died before we reached the road. The merchants who found me thought I was a beggar's orphan. They never knew. He closed his eyes as if her words were blades. Dear God. She turned from him, clutching the nearest chair for balance. You did this. I didn't know. His voice cracked. Janice, if I had known who you were... You wouldn't have married me, she spat. Would that have been your act of mercy? No. His eyes burned with something between guilt and sorrow. I would have spent my life at your feet begging for forgiveness. Her breath came in shudders. You expect me to believe you regret it now? I regretted it long before I knew your name, he said quietly. There are nights I still wake to the smell of that fire. The king told us your family was aiding the rebellion, that killing them would end the war. I believed him. I wanted to prove my loyalty. I was 19, and I thought obedience was virtue. His voice dropped. I've been paying for that mistake ever since. Lightning split the sky, filling the room with white. Janice stared at him, her chest tightening. For a heartbeat she saw not the cold Duke of Westmere, but the haunted young man beneath the title, a man who carried ghosts he'd never dared to name. Then the moment broke. She gathered the letters and hurled them at his chest. You killed my family, she said, voice trembling. And you call that obedience? He caught the papers, his expression hollow. You don't have to forgive me. Good, she whispered, because I never will. She fled the room, her footsteps echoing through the corridors. She didn't remember reaching the stables. The storm had turned savage, tearing at her hair and soaking her gown until it clung to her like a second skin. She climbed onto a horse and rode blindly into the rain, her heart pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape. The world blurred. Trees, fences, cliffs, everything drowned in fury. Somewhere behind her, she thought she heard him shouting her name, but the wind swallowed his voice. When she finally stopped, she was at the edge of the cliffs. The sea roared below, wild and merciless. She slid from the saddle, her knees hitting the mud. She clutched the last letter, the decree with her family's name, and pressed it to her chest. Why? She whispered. Why did you have to be the one? Rain blurred her vision, but through it came the sound of hooves. Janice! She turned. The Duke dismounted, cloak whipping violently in the wind. It wasn't what you think. Her laugh was broken. Then tell me, Your Grace, what else could it be? The king lied, he said, voice raw. He told us the Harlands were traitors. I see now they were only in his way. He wanted their land, their power. You believed what was convenient, she said bitterly, because loyalty is easier than guilt. He stepped closer, water streaming down his face. You don't have to believe me, but I swear to you I will make it right. I'll bring down the man who made me your enemy." She shook her head. "You can't undo the past." "No," he said softly, "but I can spend the rest of my life paying for it." By dawn, the storm had broken. She was gone. The servants found her horse near the cliffs. Her footprints led toward the forest. When Elias told him, Jackson only nodded. "Don't follow her." The old steward hesitated. "And if she never returns?" Jackson's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the sea met the light. "Then I'll deserve it." The royal chamber smelled of polished marble and deception. Candles flickered along the gilded walls, their flames bending under the weight of silence. The king sat slouched upon his throne, the faintest smirk curling his mouth, the smile of a man who had never known consequence. "You request an audience, Westmere," he said lazily, tracing the rim of his goblet. "And yet you enter my hall as though you mean to declare war." Jackson bowed stiffly, every muscle coiled tight beneath his coat. "I demand the truth." The king arched a brow. "About what exactly?" "You ordered the execution of the Harland family under false pretenses." The words cut like steel. "You told the council they conspired with the northern rebels. I've seen the reports. There was no proof, only your seal." The king's eyes glittered, amused. "Careful, Duke. To question the crown is to question the realm." "I carried out that order," Jackson said through clenched teeth. "Their blood is on my hands because I believed your lies." "Believed?" The king leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. "No, my dear Duke, you obeyed. That is why I favoured you." Jackson's jaw tightened, fury trembling just beneath the surface. "You used me." The king's smile was thin as a blade. "I gave you purpose." For a moment neither spoke. The air pulsed with unspoken hatred. Then Jackson's voice broke the silence, softer now, but heavy with something that almost sounded like regret. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "I should have known the moment I heard her name." The king's expression sharpened. "Her name?" A flicker of realization flashed across Jackson's face. Too late. "Nothing that concerns you." But the king was already standing, his voice turned to ice. "Everything concerns me." Their gazes locked, one laced with dawning suspicion, the other with the bitter knowledge that something irreversible had just been said. Jackson exhaled slowly, then bowed, his tone calm but deadly. "Then you'll forgive me, Your Majesty, if I finally stop obeying." Jackson met his gaze, cold, defiant, then turned on his heel and left the hall. The echo of the doors slamming reverberated through the marble chamber long after he was gone. The king remained seated, fingers tapping the armrest once, twice. That tone, that hesitation. He'd heard many men speak before him, liars, lovers, traitors, fools, but the Duke of Westmere was not one to slip. And yet, he had. The king rose and paced toward the tall window, the stormlight flickering across his face. "Her name, a lady," he murmured to himself. He says it as if it burns. He remembered the gossip at court, how the cold duke had shocked everyone by marrying a merchant's adopted daughter after he had asked the duke to get married. A quiet, plain girl. He'd dismissed it then, and was only happy that the duke is married. Now he replayed the look on the duke's face, that rare crack in the armour, and he asked himself a question no one else dared. What kind of woman could wound the devil duke so deeply? No lady of court had ever moved him before, not even those who had tried to buy his affection. So who was she, really? His gaze drifted toward the fire. A memory stirred, of a burning estate, the Harlan crest collapsing into ash. Of a report left incomplete, a child missing from the ruins. He froze. Adopted. The girl, his wife, was said to be adopted. The pieces began to fit together, slowly, cruelly. A child lost a decade ago. The Duke's new wife. The king's lips curved into a thin smile. Could it be? He turned to the guard by the door, his voice calm but threaded with steel. "Summon Lord Grayson," he said. "Now." The guard hesitated. "Your Majesty?" "I wish to know more about the girl married to the Duke of Westmere." When the man bowed and hurried off, the king turned back to the window, his reflection split by the lightning that flared beyond. If she truly was a Harland, then fate had played its cruelest hand, the last surviving heir bound in marriage to the very man who'd destroyed her bloodline. The king's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "So the Duke has a ghost in his halls," he whispered. "How poetic." He straightened his crown, his voice a quiet blade in the empty chamber. "And if that ghost lives, she dies by my hand. If the one you loved destroyed your family without knowing, could you ever forgive them?" The world beyond Westmere had never felt so vast or so merciless. The rain had ended 2 days ago, but the air still smelled of storm and salt. Janice had taken refuge in an abandoned cottage near the old border road, surviving on water from the stream and scraps she could trade in nearby villages. The forest whispered with crows and wind. It was as if the whole earth had gone quiet just to listen to her break. Every night she dreamt of the fire again. Her father's voice, her mother's hand slipping from hers, the weight of smoke. And always, always, the sound of soldiers shouting her family's name. Harland. Each time she woke, her body trembled as though she'd relived it all. And each dawn, she pressed on further north, trying to find some corner of the realm untouched by the Duke of Westmere, by the king, by her own blood-soaked name. But peace is never merciful to the lost. At Westmere Hall, Jackson hadn't slept. The house had fallen into silence. Servants walked as if afraid to stir the air. He sat in his study, her empty chair across from him, the ghost of her voice echoing in the quiet. He had tried to write to her, 100 letters, none of which made it past the first line. "Janice, I didn't know. Janice, I was a fool. Janice, I—" He burned everyone. Finally, on the 3rd morning, he saddled his horse and rode out before dawn. He had one destination in mind, the Graysons, the merchant family who had once called her their daughter. The Grayson Manor stood on the edge of the trade quarter, elegant and hollow. The scent of debt and desperation lingered in the air. When the Duke's carriage stopped before their gate, the servants scattered like startled birds. Brandon Grayson, smug as ever, but paler than Jackson remembered, greeted him with a forced smile. "Your Grace," Brandon stammered, bowing. "An unexpected honour. Where is your father?" Brandon swallowed. "Inside. He's unwell." "I asked where," Jackson said evenly, and Brandon flinched at the tone that brooked no disobedience. A moment later, Reginald Grayson, bloated and grey-eyed, appeared in the doorway. He bowed low, clutching his cane. "Your Grace, what brings you to us?" "Your daughter," Jackson said quietly. "Janice." The man froze, his knuckles whitening around the cane. We haven't seen her since her wedding, Your Grace." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "You took her in. You raised her. Why?" Reginald's throat bobbed. "It was charity. We found her after the war. We thought she was part of it. A child abandoned by the road. She had nothing. No name. No family. We took her in because it earned you favour with the nobles," Jackson interrupted. The merchant flinched, caught. "We didn't know who she was." "Didn't you?" Reginald hesitated, then looked down. "Not at first. She was 9 when we found her, shivering in a servant's cloak, barely able to speak. She never spoke of her family, never spoke of her name until she was older. When she said she remembered being called Janice Harland, we thought it was fantasy, until your marriage brought her back into the world's eyes, and the king began asking questions." Jackson's jaw tightened. "The king?" Reginald nodded nervously. "He sent words days ago. He asked if the girl you married had any recollection of her past. We told him she did not, though, but Your Grace—" His voice trembled. "If she speaks, if she tells anyone, the king will have our heads for lying to the crown." Jackson stared at him, realization slicing through him. You mean to silence her? Reginald's silence was confirmation enough. The Duke's voice turned deadly quiet. If you harm her, you will wish the king himself had dealt with you. Reginald swallowed, sweat dripping down his temple. She's not here. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Miles away, Janice made her way along the border path, unaware that men were closing in. She had stopped near a stream to wash the mud from her hands when the sound of hoofbeats broke through the quiet. 3 men emerged from the trees, cloaked, armed, their eyes cold with purpose. Lady Westmere, one sneered. Your father sends his regards. She froze. My adoptive father, the man smirked. Said to make it quick. A clean death cost less than a scandal. Panic struck her chest. She turned to run, but one caught her arm and slammed her against the ground. Pain tore through her ribs. She clawed at his hand, bit his wrist. He cursed and struck her hard across the face. Should have stayed buried like the rest of them, he hissed. But before the dagger fell, a shout split the air. Get away from her! The man turned, just in time to see the Duke's horse thunder through the trees. Jackson leapt from the saddle, drawing his blade in one motion. The first attacker barely had time to parry before the steel cut him down. The others fled, crashing through the underbrush. Jackson knelt beside her. Blood streaked her cheek. Her breathing was ragged. Janice, he whispered. She tried to pull away. Don't touch me. He froze. You've taken everything from me, she said, voice trembling but clear. My name, my peace, my family. What else is left for you to ruin? He closed his eyes, exhaling like a man breaking. Not this, he said. Not you. When she lost consciousness, he caught her before she hit the ground. He brought her home. The journey back to Westmere was silent. He rode beside the carriage, every hoofbeat echoing against the hollow in his chest. When they arrived, he carried her inside himself despite the servants' protests and laid her gently upon her bed. He cleaned the wound at her temple, wrapped the bandage with hands that shook. Every breath she took felt like a fragile miracle. When night fell, he sat in the chair by her bedside, head in his hands. The mask he had worn all his life cracked. I was 19, he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. The king called it a campaign of justice. He told us the Harlands had betrayed the realm, that their death would bring peace. I believed him. He looked at her sleeping form. You were a child. You ran into the forest. The reports said no one survived. I saw your home burn. I remember your father shouting your name, Janice. I told myself it was the wind. His hand tightened around the edge of the chair. I've carried that sound for 11 years. The candlelight trembled as his breath hitched. I've killed many men in the king's service, but only one death ever haunted me. I see your father's eyes every time I close mine. He drew a shuddering breath. When I met you again, I didn't know. But something in me knew I owed you sorrow. I saw it the day I first looked into your eyes. That was why I couldn't be cruel to you no matter how I tried. He lifted his gaze toward the window, where rain began again, gentle this time. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve your name. But if you wake and tell me to go, I will. I'll never bind you again. His voice dropped to a whisper. You were never my property, Janice. You were the only mercy the past left me. He bowed his head beside her, broken in the silence. When dawn came, the first light touched her face. Her lashes fluttered, her breath steady but weak. Jackson sat where he had been all night, his shoulders heavy, his eyes red from sleeplessness. She turned her head slightly toward him, but said nothing. They were both awake now, prisoners of the same past, haunted by the same fire, and neither knew if love could ever survive what the truth had burned away. The news broke like thunder before dawn. Elias burst into the Duke's study, his face pale beneath the glow of the dying hearth. "Your Grace," he started, voice shaking. "There's a decree from the Crown. It's about her." Jackson looked up from his desk, the quill stilling mid-word. "What decree?" Elias swallowed hard. "The King's Council has declared Lady Janice a traitor reborn. By royal command, she is to be executed before the week's end." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the quill snapped between Jackson's fingers. He rose slowly, his chair scraping back across the stone. "Where is she?" "She's awake, my lord," Elias whispered. "But she hasn't been told." Jackson didn't answer. He strode from the room, the echo of his boots following him like a warning bell. Janice stood by the window of her chamber, wrapped in one of his coats. The bandages on her shoulder were fresh, the wound still aching where the king's hired men had tried to end what the fire years ago could not. She looked out at the frost-covered gardens below, the same gardens that had once frightened her, now her only refuge. She turned when the door opened. Jackson's face was carved from stone, but his eyes, they betrayed the storm underneath. "You're safe," he said, though the words sounded like a vow meant for himself. "Safe," she repeated softly. "Is that what this is?" He hesitated, but didn't lie. "For now." Her gaze narrowed. "Then tell me the truth." He moved closer, and for once he didn't hide behind his titles. "The king knows. He's ordered your death." She didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She only stared at him, her lips parting slightly as the meaning sank in. "Because I am my father's daughter," she murmured. He nodded once. "Because the king fears what your name means, what it could expose." Her eyes flicked toward him, wide with realization. "The documents you found in London, you still have them, don't you?" He froze. "You shouldn't know about that." "I'm tired of being kept in the dark," she said fiercely. "I have lived my whole life running from shadows you created, Jackson. I won't run anymore." He exhaled, a sound closer to a plea than a breath. "You think I want you hidden out of pride? I want you alive." "And what life is that?" she asked quietly. "Caged? Protected until I disappear again?" Her words hit him like a blade drawn slow and clean. Jackson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then we fight." Her heart stuttered. "Against the crown." He didn't blink. Against a lie. The hours that followed were fevered and silent. In the library they worked side by side, Janice's trembling fingers sorting through ancient parchment, Jackson pacing the length of the table, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up. By candlelight they unearthed letters, land decrees, and records stamped with the royal seal, the same seal that had condemned the Harlands. Among them lay a sealed confession, a confession written by a dying noble years ago, attesting that the king had fabricated the charge of treason to claim the Harland estate for his personal treasury. Jackson had taken it years ago from a dying viscount, the very official who'd once overseen the Harland trial. The man had summoned the Duke in his final hours, begging absolution for his part in the lie. Jackson had dismissed it then as the delirium of guilt, but he'd kept the document nonetheless, locking it away with other state archives he was too cautious to destroy. Now the truth that once seemed madness was laid bare before them both. Janice pressed the page to her chest. This is the proof." Jackson's gaze lingered on her, the firelight trembling over her face, the defiance in her eyes, the strength he once mistook for fragility. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's proof of everything I destroyed." She shook her head, tears burning in her eyes. "No, you were a pawn, like my father, like me. But now we have the truth. We can end it." He looked at her then, really looked, at the woman who had walked into his cursed halls and refused to break. The air between them was charged, fragile, alive. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. "Janice." Her breath hitched. "Don't." but she didn't step away. "I no longer hate you, Jackson," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't bear to lose you again." He caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "Then don't." Her eyes met his, wide and searching. And in that moment, something shifted. The hatred, the fear, the guilt. It all burned away, leaving only two souls that had been waiting too long to stop running. Outside, the sky began to lighten. The first faint glow of morning bled across the horizon, painting the storm-torn world in silver. Jackson turned to Elias, who stood watch by the door. "Send word to London. We ride at dawn." Elias hesitated. "Your Grace, that would mean defying a direct royal order." Jackson's reply was calm, but it carried the weight of finality. "The crown may command my title, but not my conscience." He turned back to Janice. "We end this, together." She looked at him, the man who had once been her captor, her destroyer, her salvation, and for the first time, she believed him. Later, when the house had quieted and the candles burned low, Janice found him alone in the corridor, staring out into the dawn. "You could still let me go," she said softly. "You'd be safer that way." He turned to her, a ghost of a smile flickering on his lips. "Safe is not what I want." She stepped closer, until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Then what do you want?" He looked down at her hand, the same one that had once trembled when she faced him. He took it gently, his thumb brushing her pulse. "Redemption," he said. "And you." Janice's throat tightened. For the first time in days, she felt something like hope stir within her. Fragile, but alive. Outside, the wind carried the sound of church bells from the distant village, the same bells that had once tolled for the Harlan's fall. Now, they rang for something else entirely. That night, Jackson's halls, once cold, silent and haunted, pulsed with quiet purpose. The servants whispered of rebellion, of forbidden love, of a duke who would rather face ruin than obey injustice. And in her chamber, Janice stood before the mirror, wrapping a dark cloak around her shoulders. The reflection that stared back at her was no longer the girl who had been sold. She was the woman who would reclaim her name. By morning, the estate gates creaked open. Riders waited. Elias among them, grim and loyal. Jackson mounted his horse, glancing once toward the window where she stood. When she joined him, the faintest smile touched his lips. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Only of losing time." He reached out a hand, and she took it, steady and sure. The Duke of Westmere and the last Harland heir rode into the rising sun, not as captor and captive, not as master and ward, but as two souls bound by the same wound, the same defiance, the same impossible hope. If you were Janice, hunted by the crown yet standing beside the man who once destroyed your family, would you fight for love or run for your life? The grand hall of the royal court had never been so silent. Gold banners hung heavy in the air, dimmed by the grey light spilling through high-arched windows. The scent of rain lingered outside, but inside, the scent of fear reigned. Every noble in the realm had been summoned, their whispers a low hum of speculation that died the moment the Duke of Westmere entered. Jackson strode through the doors like a storm-given form. His coat was black as midnight, his gloves soaked from the morning rain. Behind him, Janice followed, veiled in grey, her face half hidden but her step unwavering. The chamber guard stiffened, and even the king's herald faltered before finding his voice. "His Grace, the Duke of Westmere, and Lady Janice of Harland," Jackson said evenly, cutting through the silence like steel. "Lady Janice Harland of Briarcliff." A wave of murmurs rippled through the hall. The king's knuckles whitened on the armrest of his throne. "Westmere," he said coldly, his voice carrying across the chamber. "You arrive unbidden, and in defiance of my decree, Have you come to deliver the traitor to justice? Jackson stopped at the foot of the dais. I've come, he said, to deliver justice to the traitor who wears a crown. Gasps broke the silence. The king's guards drew their swords, but the king raised a single hand, halting them. Careful, Westmere, he said softly. Even your reputation cannot protect you from treason. Nor can yours, Jackson answered. He reached into his coat and pulled forth a leather-bound folder, bound in the seal of the crown itself. He tossed it onto the marble floor where it slid and came to rest at the king's feet. I believe you'll recognize that seal, he said. It bears your signature and the confession of the man who served you. The king did not move, but his eyes, sharp, black as coal, flickered with something that looked almost like fear. Jackson's voice deepened, steady and sure. For 20 years you called the Harlands traitors. You burned their home, took their lands, and branded their bloodline cursed. But you knew the truth. You always knew. He gestured toward Janice, who stood still beside him, her chin raised despite the tremor in her breath. Her family was innocent. Their only crime was loyalty. Loyalty you feared would one day expose you. The nobles began to whisper among themselves, names, dates, fragments of memory piecing together a truth they had been too frightened to consider. The king's voice broke through the murmur. Lies, he said sharply. Forged by a guilty conscience, you would destroy your sovereign for a woman's tears. Jackson took a step forward. No, Your Majesty, for her truth. He turned and nodded to Elias, who emerged from the crowd with a second document. It was the dying confession of the Viscount, sealed in blood and bearing the royal crest. Elias placed it before the council table. One of the older ministers, Lord Darrow, leaned forward, reading the faded script aloud. By order of the king, the Harland family was condemned not for treason, but for possession of estates desired by the Crown Treasury. He looked up, face pale. It bears the late Viscount Cadell's hand, and His Majesty's signature beneath. Gasps swept the chamber. The Queen's adviser rose, his voice trembling. Your Majesty, is this true? The king's composure cracked. You dare question your king? But it was too late. The council's murmurs rose to a roar. Accusations, disbelief, outrage. The nobles who had once knelt now began to step back, unwilling to be caught in the shadow of a fallen tyrant. Jackson turned to face the crowd, his voice carried above the noise, ringing with conviction. You all feared him. So did I. But fear ends today. The Harlands were loyal to this realm, and this woman— He turned, his gaze softening as it found Janice. Is the last of their line. You will not speak her name with shame again. The king rose from his throne, his fury trembling through every word. You insolent fool. You think the council will side with a disgraced soldier and an orphaned girl? The duke met his gaze with quiet, deadly calm. They'll side with the truth, because the days of your lies are done. The thunder that rolled outside seemed to answer him. Janice stepped forward. The veil slipped from her shoulders, revealing her face, pale, proud, unflinching. My father served this realm until the day you branded him a traitor, she said. My mother begged for mercy. Your mercy. You burned them alive and called it justice. The king's hand twitched toward the guards. Enough! Jackson stepped between them, drawing his sword in one clean motion. Touch her, he said quietly, and you'll lose more than your throne. The king hesitated, reading the hall. Too many eyes, too many doubts. He could no longer command the same obedience he once did. Jackson raised his voice for all to hear. She is not my property, he declared. She is my equal, the truest soul in this cursed kingdom, and I would rather die beside her than live another day serving your deceit. For a heartbeat, the entire chamber froze. Then, one by one, the nobles knelt. First Lord Darrow, then the Chancellor, then the rest, until even the guards lowered their swords, bowing their heads. The king stood alone, his fury curdled into something like disbelief. "You dare defy me?" Jackson sheathed his sword and stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "No, I remove you." And with that, he placed the Viscount's confession on the throne itself, a symbolic act that echoed louder than any blade could strike. The king's fate was sealed. The council's decision was swift. By dusk, royal messengers had been dispatched to announce the truth across the realm. The Harlands were cleared of all charges, their estate to be restored to its rightful heir. As for Janice's adoptive parents, their names were stripped from every ledger, their holdings seized, the crown's silence bought with the fortune they'd once demanded for selling her. When it was done, the nobles of the realm gathered once more in the great hall. Jackson stood at the head of the dais, the royal banner behind him replaced by the seal of the council. The storm had broken, and in its wake came light. He turned to Janice. "It's over," he said softly. She looked up at him, eyes glistening, not from sorrow but release. "No," she whispered, "it's only beginning." And then before the council of nobles, before the gathered kingdom itself, Jackson did the unthinkable. He reached for her hand. He drew her closer. And kissed her, not as a duke claiming victory, but as a man finally freed from the chains of his past. The hall erupted, not with outrage, but applause. Outside, thunder rolled one last time, not in warning, but in triumph. That night, as the city lights flickered against the rain-swept cobblestones, the Duke of Westmere and the last Harland heir stood together on the palace balcony, watching the storm pass. The world had changed, justice had come, and love, fierce, forbidden, and defiant, had survived it all. The winter had melted quietly that year, as if the world itself had grown weary of grief. Spring came to Westmere not with thunder but with music, soft laughter spilling from the open windows, the hum of life returning to halls once echoing only with silence. It had been 6 months since the fall of the king. 6 months since Jackson had stood before the court and broken his chains in full view of the realm. The crown was now ruled by a council, and though the nobles begged him to take the throne himself, he refused. He had no desire for crowns or titles anymore, only for peace, for her, and for the home that had been born of both their scars. The Duke of Westmere had once been a fortress of solitude. Now it breathed. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows of the great hall, illuminating the dust motes that danced like golden threads in the air. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, their faces softened with something rare in noble houses, joy. And in the library, the same room where pain had once shattered her world, Janice now sat near the fire, one hand resting protectively on the gentle swell of her stomach. Jackson found her there, as he often did, his steps soundless until she looked up. She smiled faintly. "You walk like a man trying not to wake ghosts." He knelt beside her chair, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "They're quieter now," he murmured. "You've given them something else to listen to." Her eyes softened. "And what's that?" He looked down at her belly, then back into her eyes. "Hope." Then, lowering himself, he pressed a gentle kiss to the curve of her stomach. His voice dropped to a whisper meant only for the child within. "You will never know the darkness that made us," he said softly, "only the light that saved us." Janice's breath caught, tears gathering in her lashes as his hand lingered there, steady, protective, certain. Outside, the gardens of Westmere had been replanted, the rose beds restored, the stone paths cleared of moss. She often walked there in the evenings, her fingers grazing the flowers that had once bent under storm and neglect. The same garden where she had once wandered alone, uncertain and unwelcomed, was now the heart of her home. But there were still matters unfinished. A letter arrived one morning, sealed in the trembling hand of her adoptive father. The ink was smudged, the words uncertain. He begged forgiveness, spoke of desperation, of debts and fear and guilt. She read it in silence, her hand shaking. For a long time she said nothing. Then she folded the letter carefully, sealed it again, and placed it in the fire. "I forgive them," she whispered. Jackson, watching from the doorway, frowned slightly. "And yet you burn the letter?" She looked up, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Forgiveness doesn't mean return," she said softly. "It means I choose peace. But peace is not the same as forgetting." He nodded once, understanding that this too was strength. A week later, Westmere's Great Hall opened its doors not for nobles or feasts, but for children. Orphans from across the realm, those forgotten by war, debt and famine, filled the space once meant for kings. Janice stood among them, her gown simple but her presence radiant. The orphanage she had founded bore a new name, the Harland House of Mercy. "Every child deserves to belong," she said as she cut the ceremonial ribbon, "and no one should ever have to earn their right to love." The crowd applauded, but Jackson only watched her in silence, his chest tightening with the quiet ache of awe. He had seen her frightened, furious, broken. Now he saw her whole. When the ceremony ended, he approached her as she stood among the children, her hands resting gently on a young girl's shoulders. "You've done what I never could," he said quietly. She turned to him, brow furrowing. "And what is that?" "Turn sorrow into grace." She smiled, the same small, steady smile that had once pulled him back from the brink. "We did it together." That night, as dusk folded over Westmere, he found her again in the candlelit hall. She wore a gown the colour of moonlight, her hair braided with silver thread. She entered quietly, yet the entire room seemed to still around her. Without a word, Jackson went down on one knee. She laughed softly, brushing his shoulder. "You're still the Duke. You don't kneel." "I do now," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You once belonged to no one, Janice. Now the world belongs to you." Tears welled in her eyes. She placed her hand on his cheek, her thumb brushing the faint scar that years of battles had left behind. "Then share it with me," she whispered, "because I don't want a world that doesn't have you in it." He rose, took her hand, and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I never imagined redemption could look like this," he said. "It doesn't," she replied softly. "It feels like this." The days that followed passed in peace, not the cold, heavy silence that once filled the estate, but the gentle rhythm of rebirth. The once feared Duke now oversaw trade routes rebuilt in the Harlands' name. The poor found employment on his lands. The council sought his counsel not for conquest, but for reform. And when the child within her stirred for the first time, Janice cried, not from fear, but gratitude. Jackson held her, his hand steady against her back. "You're trembling," he murmured. She smiled through her tears. "I never thought I'd live to see a future that wasn't haunted." He pressed his lips to her temple. "You gave it to us." One evening, the sky turned grey again, not with thunder, but soft rain. She walked through the garden, one arm linked with his. The air smelled of roses and wet earth, just as it had on the night she first arrived at Westmere, frightened and alone. But this time she was not alone. The rain fell softly, a baptism of memory. The stone walls gleamed, the roses bowed, and the sound of laughter echoed faintly from the hall behind them. The laughter of children, of servants, of life. Jackson drew her closer beneath the shared shelter of his cloak. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured. "The same rain that once brought ruin now brings peace." She looked up at him, her eyes bright beneath the dim light. "That's what love does," she said. "It doesn't erase the storm. It teaches you to walk through it." He smiled, and for once the Duke of Westmere looked at peace. They paused by the old stone bench beneath the weeping willow, the same place where she had once stood trembling, afraid of him. Now she sat there beside him, her head against his shoulder, the rain whispering like a hymn. Jackson exhaled slowly, his hand resting over hers. "I used to believe fate was a chain," he said, "unbreakable, unchangeable." Janice turned her face toward him, her smile quiet but sure. "And now?" He kissed her knuckles, his voice a vow. "Now I believe fate bends to those who dare to love." She leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek. "Then we'll keep bending it together." As the rain fell, the lamps of Westmere glowed in the distance, casting golden halos through the mist. The Duke and his wife walked hand in hand through the garden that had once been barren, reborn under the same sky that had once mourned. Life had come full circle, sorrow turned to grace, ruin to rebirth, chains to choice. And as the night deepened, the house that had once belonged to ghosts now belonged to laughter, to love, to legacy. Do you believe love can rewrite destiny? Or are some fates unchangeable? Share your thoughts in the comments. Some storms end in ruin, but others begin in light.